Before we begin our class, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. God, we are so grateful for your mercy and your kindness and your gentleness with us. We thank you so much that Jesus paid the price for our sin and that he took care of the justice. We pray that we'll never take that for granted, but we'll realize what a price was paid for our sin. Lord, we thank you that we have the story of the Exodus in the Old Testament to show us the power that you have over all other so-called gods and the love that you have for your people to deliver them through trials. Help us to learn what we need to learn today that will help us become better Christians. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so Exodus chapter 6 is where we're going to start in just a few moments. Exodus chapter 6. But before we do that, I have a couple things I want to talk about. I've read a book last year. One of the books I read last year was this book about storytelling, and it has the 24 laws of storytelling. And I thought it would be helpful for us as we're looking at the book of Exodus to look at some of these laws that people have discovered and know that God knew these laws way before man ever discovered them. That's what I love about people write books, and you find the principles found in God's book. And you see, the only reason that they work is because they're in God's book first. So here's one of them. It says a story that fails to provide challenges for its character does not deserve to exist. Too many stories fall flat due to the soft treatment of their characters. Obstacles drive stories. In general, the crueler these obstacles are, the better. And the principle here is be cruel to your characters by threatening them. What they treasure most dearly. This isn't to be sadistic. It makes your characters more likable, relatable, and gives meaning to your story. Your audience will grow to respect you because your plot's unfortunate turns make it appear more realistic. Now, how many of you think God does that perfectly? I mean, God does that perfectly, right? So as you're reading the book of Exodus, and you see all these just terrible twists and turns and how you could say that being cruel to the characters and how Pharaoh's being cruel. And that story's recorded for us in that way because God knows that when you see how these people are being treated so cruelly and you see at times they fail, right? They don't have the faith. They don't get it. When they grow and they overcome those failures, that gives you a lot more respect for who they are because of what you've seen they've gone through. So Moses went through a lot. Moses made excuse after excuse after excuse. He's not done making excuses, right? But how many of you have a very positive view of Moses in your mind? I mean, we all think Moses was great. If God doesn't include all these challenges and struggles in the Bible for us to read, we're going to miss all of that. And the story's not going to be as compelling. I was telling, Brandon asked a question a couple weeks ago right at the end, and Brian dealt with this a little bit last time as well. I think sometimes these details are recorded for us and God does something a certain way just because he knows how powerful that story is going to be later. So, Brian talked about the claw. Why couldn't he just take the claw, take them all out, and put them over in the land of Canaan? God could have put them in the land of Canaan any way he wanted to, right? He could have just killed all the Egyptians at once. He could have just killed all the people of Canaan. He could have taken them straight from there, put them over the land of Canaan, and houses that were already built, and vineyards that were already grown, and let them just have these wonderful meals. But where is that story for them in building their character and their appreciation? Testing their hearts, and where does that leave us, right? We don't even read the story, to be honest with you. We're like, this isn't a very good story, and we don't read it. God knows how to write the story so that it's compelling to us because he created our brains, right? And so he knows how we're going to react to that particular story, and I think that's just powerful as we read through the book of Exodus. We're not going to look at all 24 laws, just 3 of them. Here's the third one. It says, trust flaws more than strengths. Stories need conflict, and a perfect character without flaws is hard to challenge. It's difficult to make an exciting story about some awesome power longer than a paragraph or two. You can, however, make endless, meaningful stories about what your characters cannot do. Don't think that writing your character as an untainted paragon of virtue will make them likable. Actually, the opposite is true. People are attracted to each other's rough edges. Your readers will relate more with your hero if they show issues that taint their character. Right? So how many times in the Bible have you been in a Bible class, you've been studying the Bible, and you say, you know what, I can't relate to Paul very well, but I sure relate to Peter. Yeah, you ever been there? Why? Because Peter seems to have more flaws, and we relate to people who overcome their flaws. And we know that they're overcoming their flaws. We can overcome our flaws. And I'm sharing these with you because what it does for me is it gives me more faith and confidence in God and His Word. It really does. It says God is so smart that everybody who thinks they're smart is really dumb compared to Him. And so He knew all this ahead of time. So that's why He's giving us the book of Exodus, and the way He's giving it to us with showing us the character's flaws, showing us the terrible challenges that they're going through so that we can relate to that better. And then we're skipping here to the 10th one here. It says, stories don't, the law here is conflict is everything, guard it at all cost. Stories don't require a lot of material to work well. Do not underestimate the simple power of playing host to a cast of likable characters, all in conflict with one another. Most of us feel timid in our daily lives, afraid to rock the boat. This may work in real life, but in storytelling, it is suicide. The most reliable way to improve your story is to dial up conflict between its characters. No one wants to read a story about sweet characters on the same wavelength who agree on everything. Create sparks, and don't be afraid to start a fire. Do we see some sparks in the book of Exodus? Do we see some fires in the book of Exodus? Do you think that's by God's design? Do you think He knew that all these years later we'd be reading it? He says, you know what? They're really going to respond well to this. You know, I'm going to twist it here. I'm going to put a twist here. I'm going to show them a flaw here. I'm going to show them a flaw there. I'm going to put this character flaw here. I'm going to put this conflict here. And that it'll keep them interested. And it is interesting. The Bible is the most interesting book ever written. And it will never, ever lose its interest to us because God is that powerful. Now, one of the things it says is a story where someone has ultimate power and cannot be touched is a story you can only write a paragraph or two about, and that's it. So you think about that. Superman. I mean, Superman can do everything, right? What's his weakness? Kryptonite, right? And without kryptonite, how interesting are those stories? You know he's always going to win, right? And it's almost like you're waiting for the kryptonite to come out. You know, where are we going to see his weakness? We're waiting for that weakness. Now, God has no weaknesses. And so you could say God always wins, so this is going to be a really dry story. But what has God done that makes this story even more incredible than anything that you can possibly make up or read? He decided to do something. He decided to give you free will. How much of the story's twists and turns and conflict is happening because people have free will? Most of them, right? If not all of them. So here we have God, who is this ultimate powerful being who could step in and take the people straight to the promised land. He could do all of those things he wanted to, but He doesn't because He knows that would not keep us interested in the story, and we're not interested in the story, we're not going to be interested in Him. It draws us to the story and draws us to Him, and I think those are very, very powerful lessons to learn. As a matter of fact, I made a list of all the conflict we've already been through. Pharaoh put the children of Israel under bondage. That's conflict. Pharaoh told the midwives to kill the babies. Conflict. Pharaoh told the Egyptians to kill the male babies. Conflict. Moses killed an Egyptian. Conflict. The Israelite called Moses out for killing the Egyptian. Conflict. When he goes to the well, there's conflict between Jethro's daughters and the shepherds. They won't let the daughters drink the water, give their sheep the water. Moses deals with that. God and Moses have a conflict at the burning bush. There's conflict between Pharaoh and Moses. There's conflict between Pharaoh and God. There's conflict between Pharaoh and the people. He is making their lives miserable. There is conflict between the people and Moses. Remember when he comes back out of the dealing with Pharaoh? Hey, God judged between you and us. You're causing all these problems. And then Pharaoh goes to God and says, God, there's a lot of conflict going on here. Why are you even started all this mess? The people aren't any better off. So there's just conflict on every single page. And Brian noted out very clearly that Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2 is the key question, and it keeps bringing us back to the conflict. And that is, who is God, that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let the people go. The rest of the book is conflict surrounded by God answering that question. And we'll see how that works out as we continue to go on. So any thoughts, questions on any of that before we move on to the actual text? I know that you guys weren't prepared to talk about that, but to me it is an amazing thing that God does all of that so that we're interested in the story. Brian has something.
Yeah, I like your point about free will, and I was just thinking in a more general sense that you have God who's just absolutely perfect, and nobody could read about this perfect being for too long. But what's interesting is he accomplishes his work through imperfect people, and that's where it's almost like humans are presented as God's kryptonite, and you're thinking, how's God going to pull us off with this guy? Like, there's no way. He keeps messing everything up. But God overcomes anyway the kryptonite of human folly.
Yeah, I was thinking sort of the free will is the kryptonite. They're giving men free will. That's the thing that really comes back. And Joe has something. In almost every story, you have the story of the flood. People have chosen not to serve God. They've chosen to go after their own evil. And they just keep going on and on and on. We see it all through the book of Exodus, and we're going to continue to see it. Joe?
I think another thing is sort of what Brian was talking about, I think previously, is where he, like I said, they picked him up and put him over in Canaan and stuff. If we read a Bible like that, yet we go out into the world and we see what we see, how conflicted we would be. Like, and what kind of God is this that it's all perfect back in Exodus, but my world's falling apart? And would you turn to a God like that? No, you'd say, well, he made it perfect for them, but he's leaving me in the lurch. So it reveals his, like you said, the mercy and the grace and the justice and the righteousness for us.
Yeah, we would definitely expect him to do the same thing for us, right? When we're having troubles, just alleviate our troubles if he did it back then. So we can expect him to do the same thing and help us through those struggles and troubles, right? Yeah, excellent, good points. All right, so let's go to our first question there. I don't know who wants to give me their summary or read their summary, but I want somebody to come up with a summary for us on Exodus chapter 6 and verse 1, 7 and verse 7. Some of you write those out. Some of you just put some bullet points there. Now remember, chapter 6 ended with the Lord responding to the people's rejection of Moses and then Moses questioning God. So chapter 5 ends with Moses saying to God, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, neither have you delivered your people at all. All right, that's how chapter 6 ended. So now we pick up in chapter 7. Somebody give us a summary. Herb had his hand up. No? We have a lot of history. Raise your hand. Okay, yeah. If you want to comment, raise your hand. You get a microphone, speak directly into the microphone. So we can hear, and people who are online can hear as well. I've been begging you guys to do these summaries, because these summaries are designed to help us tell these stories to other people. It's the first step. If you can't summarize it, then you're going to have a hard time telling it.
You wanted to summarize verse 6 through 7,
Chapter
right?
6 through 7.
Okay.
Speak directly into it, Carol.
God gives Moses 3 reminders that A, God is in control, B, God will always keep his covenant, and C, God saves, he will deliver.
All right, very good. There's a summation of what's going on there. Anybody else have something they'd like to share? Okay, let's go ahead and read some of it then. Exodus chapter 6, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand I will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, and by my name, the Lord, I was not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage in which they were strangers. I have also heard the groanings of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from your bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out of the land under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to your fathers Isaac and to Jacob, and I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord. So Moses spoke to the children of Israel, but they did not heed the words of Moses because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. So what I did on this, and I'll just show you my coloring here, is I went through and to sort of summarize and get what's going on in my own mind straight. God's making an argument. This is what life is like in Egypt. This is what Pharaoh has done to you. Here is who I am, and this is how I'm going to treat you. So when you have this idea of the Egyptians, look at verse 5. It uses the word bondage. Okay, at the very end, I have the Egyptians keep you in bondage. He uses the word bondage again in verse 6. So in verse 6, he uses the word burden. And in verse 7, he uses the word burden. So life in Egypt, bondage and burden. That's to get out of what life is like in Egypt. Bondage and burden. Now, what does that do for the children of Israel? First of all, in verse 5, it causes them to groan. He heard their groaning. And if you go down to verse 9, the very end of verse 9, anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. So that's what it was like to live under the Egyptian rule. Bondage, it was burdensome, and it was something that caused them to groan and to grieve and have an anguished spirit. But then if you start contrasting that to what God is promising them, in verse 5 it says, I heard your groanings. I remembered my covenant. Verse 6, I will rescue. Verse 6, I will bring you out. Verse 6, I'll redeem. Just how amazing is that? Just look, I will rescue, I will bring you out, I will redeem. That's what I am going to do. Verse 7, I will take you as my people. You're going to be my special people. That's what I'm going to do for you. You're not going to be my slaves. You're going to be my special people. Again in verse 7, I will bring you out. I will bring you in the land and give it to you as a heritage. You see the contrast? So that's what God's trying to say. Here's the Egyptian bondage. Here's what it's like under me. We notice the first recipients. We'll talk about them in just a second. But I think that's all very, very important that God is trying to get them to distinguish. Any thoughts or questions or anything you'd like to add just in those first 10 verses? All right, we have a couple. We have Carol down here as well. Carol. Go ahead, Joe.
What was interesting to me is at the end of 5, Moses is despondent, like you said, why are you doing this? And then at the very beginning of 6, at least in the NASB, it talks about now you will see. It's on God's time frame. If you go back to the end of 3, he says, I'm going to do this, but he's going to do it on his time frame. I think it's very interesting that this goes in and out. But anyway, I think it's very interesting that he says now. See, so he's saying, don't worry, I'll take care of it, and I'm going to do it now.
Yeah, I've titled this in my head, and I think on my outline, God is reassuring Moses. The end is certain. Now, all what's going to happen before the end happens, it may not be certain. There may be twists and turns in here, but I am going to bring them out of Egypt, and I'm going to take them to the land of Canaan. That much you can count on, Moses. The stuff in between there might be some surprises and some twists and the turns, but you know that it's going to come out. As a matter of fact, my hand is going to be so strong against Pharaoh, he's going to drive them out. He's going to want them to leave. He's going to beg them to leave. He said, get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. And I think that's an important thing. Carol?
I had 5 I will statements, and I had them marked out as the first one being liberation, the second one being redemption, the third being adoption, the fourth inheritance, and the fifth judgment. And it's all in correlation to how Jesus is going to come and save us from our sins.
Right, very good. That's a very, very good thought. Thank you for sharing those. So those things that you had, I will statements and what they mean. So very good. And that's how Jesus saves us as well. All right, we have Jason.
God, I went to Pharaoh, like you said, and nothing's happened. What's going on here? Well, if Moses had gone to Pharaoh and said, hey, we're going to take off, is that okay? And Pharaoh said, yeah, that's cool. Not only do you have a bad story like you were talking about, but it doesn't demonstrate God's power. It doesn't demonstrate that God is the one who is saving them. And if it was just, somebody said free will. If we didn't have free will, if we didn't have the choice to obey or disobey, all of this is pointless. There's nothing we're supposed to be doing here. I think Tim Welsh said one time in a class that Matt referenced, the striving is the point. God wants us to strive to him, regardless of whether or not there are obstacles or difficulties. But in this instance, if everything would have just happened easy, when they went to take the land, there wouldn't have been talk of, oh, we've heard about your God, because he wouldn't have actually done anything.
Yeah, without question. God's doing it to show who he is. He's answering chapter 5 and verse 2, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? They do not know the Lord, I will not obey his voice. He's answering that question. And free will is a blessing because free will actually gives God what he wants. He wants people to choose him, right? He wants us to choose him. And so when we choose him, God gets what he wants. And if he doesn't give us free will, we can't choose him. He can make us do whatever he wants, but he doesn't do that. All right, so verses 10, 11, 12, and 13 are sort of just an expression there. Go tell Pharaoh. If God tells you all this, and so you're all hyped up, yes, we're going to deliver, yes, all this stuff. He goes, go back to the children of Israel. You go back to the children of Israel and tell them all this stuff, and they say, no, Moses, we're not interested. And then God says, oh, go tell Pharaoh. What was Moses' reaction? Would your reaction be any different than that? The reaction was, I can't go tell Pharaoh. My own people won't even listen to me. How am I going to go to tell Pharaoh? You think we need to get our people on our side first before we go to Pharaoh? And so he is told to go to Pharaoh. Then you have this parenthetical section here where he gives let's go ahead and answer question number 2. How do you think Moses felt during all of this, and what do you think he learned or didn't learn? Anybody have something you want to share in question number 2? All right. Herb has something? I did a mistake in my outline today. And I hate when I do this. I printed front and back. I never print front and back, but I did today, so I'm all messed up. There we go. Herb.
I sympathize with that. I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but he didn't feel like that he had confidence. And you said, how did he feel? And what do you think you said leaned. I think you meant learned.
Learned, yes.
He learned that God still expected Moses to obey him, and that still expected Moses to do what God said, and that Aaron would help him. He learned that, and he learned that God wanted him to learn that God would keep his promise, and God would deliver, as Carol so well pointed out. He would deliver, he would redeem, he would adopt. That's what I think.
All very good. All very good. Yeah, we wanted him to have more faith, right? He wanted to learn that God's going to deliver. All those things. He wanted to learn. I think one other point you made, that Moses, you got to do what I tell you to do. Okay? You need to learn to just obey me and quit asking me so many questions and quit having so many objections here. At some point, you just got to obey. And there are phrases in there where it says, Moses did. Moses and Aaron did, which shows that he is learning that. This is the process of him learning it, right? Because later on, he's a different character, right? He's a different person based upon all these struggles he's going through. Randy, and then who else has a microphone? Joe has one.
Yeah, to state it simply, he learned you have to do it God's way. And we have to learn that too. And if we're patient, we'll see that it works every time.
Yeah, perfect. You got to do it God's way. You had to learn that. Joe?
Well, and I sort of mentioned this, in God's time. God was ready to answer. He's now ready to answer. Okay, Pharaoh doesn't know who I am. Now I'm going to answer that question, and now is the time. So it had to be in his time.
Yeah, how many of you always love God's timing and you always welcome with open arms? How many of you sometimes prefer your own timing? I have to be honest with you, and I have to learn the same lesson that Moses had to learn. It's not my timing. I don't get to choose the time. God chooses the time, and I have to learn to deal with that, and I have to learn to accept that, and I have to learn to like that, and that's a growing process. Carol?
Well, I think you kind of just said it. I think Moses mainly learned that things aren't always as they seem. And a lot of times when we have a problem and we'll pray to God, sometimes before we get an answer, we get another problem. And then we think, well, you're not listening to me. You're not working with me here. And things just aren't always as they seem. Sometimes those problems lead to another answer. And we just have to be patient, and we have to let God work it out His way.
And I'm sure all of us have experienced where we just think this is the worst thing in the world that could possibly happen. And then before you know it, oh, that was a pretty good thing that happened, right? How many of you ever thought about that? This happens all the time in our lives. You just think, hey, God, what are you doing here? Do you really know what you're doing? And then you find out, yeah, he really did know what he was doing, and it was a lot better than what I thought I should be doing. So I'm sure glad he did what he wanted to do instead of listening to me, because I don't know what I'm talking about. And isn't that what we need to learn through the course of our life? We all face things that we don't like and that we don't want to go through, but it is life. And God's going to be there with us. That's the promise. Brian, and then go ahead, Brian.
Moses certainly would have been feeling confused and discouraged.
Frustrated down
Frustrated,
as well.
right, with the failure. And what I find interesting is God roots the answer to Moses' frustration in his character. He says, I am the Lord. And
3 times in that passage
and that's always what it has to come back to whenever we're going through horrendous trials. Because obviously Satan's getting us to doubt God's character. But if you just remind yourself who God is, how powerful he is, how merciful he is, how he's got everything planned out and in control, that's ultimately where our confidence lies, in the character of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. If you go through it, and I might do this for you for next time. If you just look at all the times in the book of Exodus and Ezekiel where that phrase, I am the Lord, almost, 90% of all the times it's in the Bible, it's in those 2 books. And so God is really trying to make them know, you know who I am, know who I am, know who I am. Jason, then we'll have to move on.
And this comment is your fault because you got me all into the whole storytelling concept and trying to understand it more than just the face value. But Moses was probably a little bit terrified too. We have the story of Esther, right? And the whole nation prayed for Esther. Why? Because she was going to walk into a room with a king and ask a favor. And she was going to address a king, and it was his right to kill. Moses is walking in asking for his people to be able to leave. And this isn't this is the first time he had gone to him. He hadn't gone with the plagues and all that. But Pharaoh could have killed Moses at any time. It was his right as the king, especially given what's about to happen. But I think Moses had to be somewhat terrified. So it's more than just God saying, look, I'm going to take care of this. It's, I am taking care of you and my people. And you have to trust me in that. Because Moses' life was literally on the line. Yeah. And sometimes I think we forget that.
Yeah, it took a lot of courage for him to go. Sometimes sometimes when we do read the Bible, we don't give these people who go through all this enough credit. And Moses has a lot of courage here. Like Peter getting out of the boat, Peter's didn't have enough faith, and Jesus does condemn him for that. But what about the guys who stayed in the boat, right? They didn't have a lot of faith either. And so sometimes when we read it, we think like the Jews of the first century, we wouldn't have done all that. We would have acted totally differently. And truth is, we probably wouldn't have. I mean, most of us would have made more excuses than Moses did. And most of us may not have even gone. All right, let's be honest. We might say, God, no, I don't think so. I'm just not going to do it. I'm sorry. And God would have had to get a lot stronger with us than he had to get with Moses. So you have this interlude here in chapter 6, 14 through 27. And I asked question number 3, what do you think we learn from this particular section? It's the genealogy. It starts out with Reuben and Simeon. And then it goes to Levi. And then it doesn't talk to any about any of the other brothers. So you have Reuben, Levi, Simeon, Levi, and he focuses on Levi. So if you read that, what did you learn from reading that? Anything? And why would Moses put it here?
Oh, I noticed that too, that I thought it was going to be a full genealogy, maybe very compressed, but it did stop at Levi. So, okay, I thought that it was because of the importance of the firstborn and as the inheritor. So it goes through the descendants of the older sons and stops at Levi to kind of spotlight Levi and foreshadow the importance they're going to have as the priestly tribe and the high priestly tribe.
All right, so Levi's the focus here, and the Levi's descendants, because the Levitical priesthood is going to be important in the books following, and so that's one reason why he does this. Mike?
I'm obsessed with numbers, and the numbers don't add up. That's what because Moses' great-grandfather was Levi, right?
Yeah.
So you got a 400-year time frame here, and unless each of the parents had their kid when they were 133 years old, the numbers don't add up.
Yeah, it's probably not a complete genealogy. It's worth listing everybody, and you know that people from different genealogies, the names would reappear. So it's probably just not a complete genealogy. The whole idea of the 400 years or the 200-something years is a whole other issue. And so being the numbers guy, maybe we'll give you that assignment. You can come up here and tell us if it's 400 years or 200-something years. A 10-minute time Mike is going to reserve for us. Yeah, that is a Mike saying no. That is a controversy there somewhat that you have to deal with. We take the 400 and something years because it's specifically mentioned in other parts of the Bible, and you have to sort of think, not all genealogies are complete, right? They don't list every single person in there. That's not unusual, so that's what I think is happening here. Terry?
What can we learn from this segment? I think what I learned from it is this is not about the Israelites. This is about God.
Okay, very good.
This is about His promise. If we look in here, Aaron and Moses were the product of their father marrying his aunt.
Yes.
And so we got a little bit of incest going on here. And to be honest with you, the Egyptians are probably looking at these people and they're saying to themselves, why not enslave them? Look at what they're doing. I don't think that the rules for incest were probably different or were not looked down upon in that day, just like they're not they're not favorably upon in our day. So I think this is about God saying, this is the promise that I made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I'm going to bring these people out no matter how terrible they are.
Okay, very good. So this isn't necessarily about the people, it's about God. I think that's a very valid point there. There is the case where he marries his aunt, which later on he's going to have to write that's illegal, right? God's going to tell him, you can't do that. He's going to have to write that down, so that does show, God does take people from bad backgrounds and do great things with them. I want to share a couple things with you here. I don't know if you can see this better than the back. All right, so you have Levi, and then you have the three sons of Levi that are mentioned there. And he's going to pick this back up. I think what he's doing, he's setting the stage for some other things he's going to talk about. Because Gershon, his responsibility in Numbers chapter 4, his family, was they were to carry the curtains of the tabernacle. So anything associated with the curtains, it was their job, except the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place. Now, the guy on the right, his family's job was basically to carry all the poles and all the poles that go into the ground, the tent pegs, the ropes, the crossbars. That's what his family carried. They all got carts to carry them on. We have Kohath, his family, they were to carry the holy items. And it was only after Aaron and his family covered them up. So Aaron and his family would go in and would cover them up with all these badger skins and all these other things. Then they would have them available for Kohath and his family to carry them to the next place. They didn't get carts, right? They had to carry them by poles typically. So that's how they were to transport their material. We just recently had a lesson on Korah. This is really pointing out why Korah's rebellion was so bad. Because Korah was a Kohathite, along with Moses and Aaron. They were Kohathites. So what was, when he goes, you don't even respect the job God gave you. He's not carrying poles and curtains. His family, they're carrying the most holy things from one place to another. And so part of this is he's setting up this conflict between the two of them. And then I have some more things here. Let me see if I can use my clicker here. So here you have Korah, and here you have Moses and Aaron, and they all go back to the Kohathites. So he's showing us who they are and where they come from. He's also, you look at, well, let me have Joe go first. Joe, you have a microphone?
Well, yeah, you had asked the question. I was just like, to me, the most immediate thing is Moses had doubts, and he's going to state the obvious because it comes down to verse 20. It was the same Moses and Aaron. In other words, Moses, I'm going to save you too. Don't worry, you're part of the group that's going to be from that perspective. And I think that would have been very comforting. And I think that's where they also may have stopped. There was no reason to keep going to the genealogy because it had to go down to Moses, if you would.
Yeah. And I think that goes into this idea. No one had to defend their authority more than Moses, except maybe Paul. Right? There were times where Paul had to defend his apostleship, right? And so here we have this case where, how many times in the book of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is it going to be where Moses' authority is challenged? I think this is put in here to say, quit challenging Moses' authority. Understand that everything he did, he came from God. You'll see that in the story in Numbers 16 when you get to the story of Korah, that the rebellion comes back. And he's saying, no, I didn't do this on my own. I did this because God told me to do it. If I did it on my own, may God strike me dead. I did it because God told me to do it. And so I think part of the reason is he's putting his sort of God is and Moses is reminding the people Moses was the rightful leader all along. He is the one God chose. And you should not be arguing with Moses. Does that make sense? So anybody else have anything for question number 3? I think I have it back up here. Carol has something. He's also introducing other characters. Eleazar is going to come up. Phineas is going to come up. So these are important characters that are going to come later. Sometimes, you know this, sometimes there'll be a movie or a book that you'll read, and they'll introduce a character but don't say much about him. Right? You don't think that's a big deal. And then later on, that character has a prominent role. And so I think that's a little bit what Moses is doing. All right.
I think one other thing that stands out about this genealogy is, again, God is not using the firstborn. In either case, you see it all the time. You see it, I can't go through it because I don't have all that in my head, but each case, it's not the firstborn who is going to lead the way. It's going to be...
it wasn't Reuben, right?
Right.
It wasn't Reuben because he had improper relationships with one of his father's concubines. It wasn't even Levi, or it wasn't Simeon because they had carried out execution against some people that they had no right to do, and it ends up being Judah. It wasn't Aaron, it was Moses. And so that does come back over and over and over again. God chooses who he wants to choose. And so you do have that going to come back in Exodus as well. All right, so question number 4. How would this text have helped the people? Remember, the first recipients, we're saying the first recipients of these books, in written form, would have been the second generation. Moses probably wrote these in the wilderness wandering. And so now my fathers didn't go in the land. One of the main purposes of all this writing is to say, go take the land. Give them the courage to go take the land. So how would this section here have helped them go take the land or help them do what God wanted them to do? We got a couple. We got Bonnie and we got Herb up here. All right, we're going to let Bonnie go first.
Very quickly, it would have shown God was in charge, and it was his plan to rescue Israel, but in his own way.
Okay, very good. God's in charge, and God's going to rescue Israel. He did rescue Israel. Being in this, think about this, being in this wilderness, yeah, it's been terrible for being here for 40 years, but it was better than Egypt. I mean, your shoes haven't worn out, you haven't been hungry, God's taking care of all of you. Don't go back to Egypt. That's another big cry of this section. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't even think about it. It's not good back there. Herb?
Hopefully it would have reminded them that Israel has often doubted God's power and plan and reminded them that the Israelites of chapter 6 didn't have faith that God would or could deliver them when they were broken and discouraged, and that they couldn't imagine anything else, I think that's already been alluded to, other than man doing something about it. They didn't realize God had the power. He promised he would deliver, as you've said, and they just didn't believe it. They thought, we got to do this ourselves. Not that I would ever take that attitude, but we think we got to do it ourselves. I think Carol talked about this, and the timing, and so hopefully it would have reminded them, God's there, He's watching, He's in control.
Yeah, all right, very good. So if you read chapter 6 and 7, what happens when you don't trust God? How does that usually turn out? I mean, how do you think they're viewing their parents at this particular point?
Not very smart.
Yeah. You know, mom and dad didn't do a very good job here. They should have had more faith. And so this writing of this reminds them, your parents failed. And that's why you're in the wilderness right now and not in the promised land. Don't do the same thing to your children. When it comes time to cross that Red Sea, you better go, because God has something good in store for you. He's made that promise. Does that make sense? Sometimes we have to make the decision in our own families to say, you know what, with all the good of my mom and dad and all the good things they do, sometimes they didn't do everything right. And I have to be honest with that, learn from that. And if they didn't trust God the way that they should trust God, I got to learn from that. And I got to trust God. I got to do what God wants me to do. Anybody have anything else in question number 4? It would have reminded them how bad Egypt really was. The bondage and the burdens and all that good stuff. It would have reminded them of that. It would have meant a lot to them when later on God says, as I was with Moses, I'm going to be with Joshua. Every time they see that God helps Moses out and that God really is working in the background, and they can say, all right, God's going to be doing that with Joshua too. I can do this now. I know that God was with Moses. I think how many of you think they probably felt a little sympathy towards Moses at this point? I mean, Moses is wandering around the wilderness too, and he's going to get ready to die. He's not going to the promised land. And look at all that our fathers put him through. Our question number 5. Anything in here that helps you that we haven't covered? All right, Chris has something, and Herb has something.
Well, we've mentioned this thing of God's timing a couple of times, and I think that's really important because, I think there's a reason God times things the way He does, because if He gave it to us right away, we wouldn't be able to demonstrate our faith because we would always have it anyways,
Sure.
if that makes sense. So sometimes getting something at the last minute or being delivered at the last minute or having to follow through and wait for Him to deliver is something we need to learn how to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Waiting for God's timing, and just with faith, not fretting, not waiting for God with being fearful, waiting with God with confidence that He's going to do something when He said He was going to do. Herb?
When you emphasize the fact that they were in bondage and slavery and would be delivered, that resonated with me because this reminds me that when I'm discouraged and beaten down by the world, that's when God's glory shines through the most. And that's when it's up to me to trust in God. And it's really valuable, important when things are the worst. When these people, how many years had they been slaves? 400 years?
Well, yeah,
approximately.
We don't know for sure. What Mike's going to do is...
Oh, no, I don't want to get into that again. So
however many... Mike, we're not going to make you do that.
At least 200 years?
It's been a while.
Yeah, sorry. So they've been slaves for those years, whatever it is.
And it really doesn't matter. A lot of these guys were slaves for their entire lives.
Yes.
Or slaves, or wandering in the wilderness for most of their life.
Yes.
So they haven't had a lot of good.
Yes, and so they're just desperate. We want change, and they chose not to trust in God for a while until Moses got them back.
Yeah. All right, everybody, thank you so much. I have the questions for Wednesday. I'll have them in the back. If nobody interrupts me between now and the time I get back to my office, I'll remember to get them out of my office and put them on that table.